Hello. This is a tricky video to record, and it's tricky because I feel very aware that there could potentially be quite a wide spectrum of people out there who might watch this video. And if you're on the pro-vax, pro-mainstream side of things, you're probably like laughing at the title. Like, why would the vaccinated need sympathy? You've done everything right. You're healthy. The vaccines are safe and effective. There's those people, but then I also feel very aware that there's a whole bunch of unvaccinated people who would probably be angry at me for even suggesting we should have sympathy. They have no sympathy at all. If the vaccines vaccinated have problems, it's tough and all this kind of stuff. And then I know there's also a whole bunch of people in between. And one of the reasons I started getting interested in this question was because I was hearing stories of vaccine regrets, people getting the vaccine and starting to regret it. But then the unvaccinated side, a lot of people had no sympathy at all. And I found that challenging because I felt that it was wrong. I felt we should have sympathy, but at the same time, I could relate a little scarily too much to some of these unvaccinated people. And so I wanted to kind of explore the topic. I'm biased, by the way. I'm on the unvaccinated side, so I'll be coming at this from that angle. But this whole idea of sympathy, I think, is a topic that transcends both sides. As I go through some of the reasons why I think people find it hard to have sympathy and the reasons why I think we should have sympathy, I think they're the same for both sides. So I'm hoping that this will be something relevant for everybody. But, you know, these are just my thoughts, so bear that in mind. So, yes, but I have decided in myself, I feel like we should have sympathy. But it wasn't, if I was morally superior, maybe some people out there are just, of course we should have sympathy. It'd be a simple thing. Other people, it's never sympathy. But for me, I think we should have sympathy. But it was there is some emotion involved that was hard to get over. And then also, there's a distinction that I find tricky between having sympathy for a person and condoning what they've done. And it's like, if somebody hurts you, you might be able to get yourself to a point where you have sympathy, you understand them, but at the same time, you don't want them to just get away with it. Like, you kind of feel like justice should be served, and you kind of want them to understand what they've done, So there's a distinction between having sympathy and then condoning what a person's done. So that's why it's a bit tricky. But I'm just gonna rant in this video. So I'll go through the reasons why I think people find it hard to have sympathy first. Start where we where we find it hard, and then I'll talk about why I think we should have sympathy later. One of the first reasons why I think people have no sympathy is because it's this idea of it being voluntary. The vaccines were a voluntary choice. That's the perception. So both sides, if you got the vaccine, it was your choice. If you didn't get the vaccine, it was your choice. And generally, if somebody pushes somebody into a vat of acid, it's easy to have sympathy for them. But if somebody jumps into a vat of acid themselves and then starts complaining about it burning and wanting sympathy, it's like it's hard to have sympathy. If somebody breaks another person's leg, if an attacker comes along and breaks somebody's leg, it's really easy to have sympathy for that person, the victim. But if a person breaks their own leg and then starts complaining how much it hurts, it's like, of course you'll help them, but it's very, you're not going to lose any sleep over it. It's like your own fault. What did you expect? You broke your own leg. So when something is voluntary, it makes it harder to have sympathy. Now, in reality, it wasn't necessarily entirely voluntary. There was a lot of coercion and pressure involved. And this one leans more towards the vax side. The pressure was going that way. All the pressure was towards getting the vaccine. So if anybody has an excuse here, it's the vaccinated side more than the unvaccinated. Because the unvaccinated side, if they didn't get the vaccine, then it was fully their choice. They can't really blame it on anybody else. So leans that way for that one. But so that's the voluntary thing, though. The second thing, being mistreated. When the more you are mistreated by somebody you're trying to help, the harder it is to have sympathy for them. If the person who breaks their own leg, before they break their own leg, you try to stop them. You say, hey, mate, don't do that. That's gonna hurt. Don't break your leg. And then he starts abusing you, and he starts laughing at you, mocking you, ridiculing you, and all this kind of stuff, and it's just humiliating you. At some point, if he starts to hurt you too much, there's a little part of you, it's much harder to have sympathy for him. And there's even a little part of you that might feel like, actually, go ahead, break your leg, mate. After a while, you start to feel that kind of feeling emerges. And the bigger the abuse gets, the more you're mistreated, the harder it is to have sympathy. So if you imagine, you ramp up the stakes and you imagine the whole community come out and they're all laughing at you and humiliating you and mocking you or something, and letting you, defending the person who wants to break his legs, and they're all just laughing at you, mocking at you and stuff, throwing eggs at you. That makes it even harder to have sympathy. And then imagine the whole community actually puts you in prison, and you lose your job and they ruin your career, and then they start kind of attacking you, and all the prison guards beat you up and abuse you, and then just keep ramping it up further, and then they burn your house down, and your wife and kids are in there and they all die. And just the more mistreated you get, the harder it is to have sympathy for the people who've just mistreated you. It becomes much, much harder. And this one leans more towards the unvax side, because the mistreatment was much more on the unvax side than the vax side. From the vax side, maybe you had a few unvaccinated people call you some names, give you some trouble, that kind of stuff. But in society, all the pressure was on the unvaccinated. So they were the ones who they were the second-class citizens. They couldn't travel, couldn't do all these, couldn't go to shops and all this kind of stuff. A lot of them lost their jobs. And I know the vaccinated side think it's justified, but in the unvaccinated's mind, they didn't think it was justified. They thought this was unjust discrimination from their point of view. So, we're talking about sympathy here. So from their point of view, it was unjust. Lost their jobs. Many of them couldn't go to college, things like that. There's even stories of people being denied hospital care. It got pretty bad. And then there's also obviously all the hatred, hateful rhetoric in the media. Justin Trudeau calling unvaccinated people misogynists and racists, and saying he has no sympathy, and there was loads of this kind of like hateful rhetoric. Ostracization. Yeah, wasn't pretty to be unvaccinated. So that is why some people, particularly on the unvaccinated side, find it hard to have sympathy when the more you've been mistreated by the other side, the harder it is to have sympathy. And then the third thing, deserters. In a war, when you've got a group of people and you're all fighting for a cause, and you all want to be in together. When you have deserters who run away from your cause and don't fight, it's generally frowned upon. And if those deserters end up getting caught by the enemy, when they run away, the enemy catches them, it's much harder to have sympathy for them than if one of your own who was fighting get caught. If one of your own get caught, you might do a mission and go and get them back. But if one of the deserters who run away, they get caught by the enemy, it's harder to have sympathy. You might say, well, it's his own fault, tough luck. And so that's another thing that people find hard. And from the vaccinated side, their cause, their fight was to stop COVID, and they wanted everybody to get the vaccine. And the people who didn't get the vaccine, they were the deserters. So it's a bit hard to have sympathy. But this is another one that leans more towards the unvaccinated side, because the minority was the unvaccinated side. They were the smaller. And so in their fight was against tyranny. And they were like, okay, let's not get the vaccine. Let's prove, let's fight tyranny. Who's with me? And then it felt like the deserters were all the people who chickened out and got the vaccine. They bowed to social pressure and they got it. And so and the more of a minority the unvaccinated side were, the more condemnation was coming down on them. And basically the more people desert you, the smaller your army gets. And the smaller your army gets, the harder the fight is for you, and the more persecution you're going to get. It's just the more, not persecution, but persecution. The harder it's going to be, and therefore, the harder it is to have sympathy, because you have to suffer more. So they are reasons why people might find it hard to have sympathy. They see it as a voluntary choice. Some people had varying levels of being mistreated, which is hard to forget sometimes. Makes it harder to have sympathy for people. And there was that feeling of desertion, of people abandoning your cause and it's like they can't just come back. There's like, hang on, you abandoned me when we needed you for our cause. You can't just come back, kind of feeling. So I think this is the feelings why people are having trouble having sympathy. But I think we should have sympathy, and these are my reasons why I think we should. The first thing to remember is that there's a wide spectrum of people, and so, like, a lot of the extreme abuse, it was only coming from a certain fringe of people. Most people in the middle were fine. Like, personally, everybody I know who was vaccinated treated me fine. I didn't have any problems at all. They were lovely. So I know some people had some difficulty with family members, but I didn't. Most of the abuse was coming from the fringes. Now, unfortunately, it was like authorities and politicians and role models in the media, but still, wasn't everybody. And also, there's an awful lot of people who have switched sides. So there are people who got the vaccine but are now fully on the unvax side, like Steve Kirsch, Robert Malone, and I'm sure there are people who have gone the other way. So it's just worth bearing in mind. Let's not tar everyone with the same brush, is what I'm trying to say there. Firstly, and then secondly, each person is unique. Again, these first three are all similar, which is that every single individual person has their own bubble of experience, information, life pressures, and everybody makes the decision that they think is right for them. And we tend to always judge other people based on our own bubble. If we had done what somebody else had done based on our own bubble, if it would be crazy to us, then we think it must be crazy for them. If it would be immoral for us, it would be immoral for them. And there's a degree of truth to that, but at the same time, people's bubbles are very different, and sometimes what somebody else does is very logically consistent and to them, and might be perfectly moral to them. In their minds, they feel that that's the right thing to do. They might be mistaken, but they're sincere. Most people are sincere in what they do. That's what I'm trying to get at. What was I going to say about that? Yeah, I think that was it. And so, and also connected to that is this idea that God is the only judge. It's an individual's. Each individual knows whether they've done something wrong or not, and it's very hard for us to judge from the outside. We don't know all the details of why people did what they did. So, yeah, it's just worth bearing all of that in mind. But the fourth thing, coercion. There was an awful lot of coercion. It wasn't an entirely voluntary choice. There was huge amounts of coercion. The most I've probably ever experienced in my life, like huge amounts of pressure. And you might think, well, that's no excuse, you just a bit of pressure, you still didn't, it was still a voluntary choice. But on top of the coercion, you've got people's view of the vaccine. If, again, we're judging by our own bubbles, if you yourself viewed the vaccine as very, very, very dangerous, and then no amount of coercion would have convinced you to get it. But if you think the vaccine's safe and effective, and then you get this little bit of coercion, well, it's like, well, I may as well just get it then, because you know what I mean. It's different for every person, and there was huge amounts of coercion. So it was just tipping people. Everybody whose view of the vaccine was like, well, it's probably safe. It was just tipping all these people over the edge, So, yeah, there was coercion, but worth bearing that in mind. And then misinformation. And this one's one of the biggest reasons why I think we should have sympathy, because firstly, when somebody is deceived, the blame goes on the deceiver, not the deceived. Generally, if a little old lady gets scammed by a bank scammer, you generally don't blame the little old lady. It's the bank scammer who gets the majority of the blame. Maybe the little old lady should have been a bit shrewder. You could teach her some lessons about that, but it's mainly the bank scammer who gets all the blame. The deceiver gets the blame, not the deceived. And so that's worth bearing in mind. And there was an awful lot of misinformation, and I can say that because both sides are thinking the same thing. The vaccinated think inside, yeah, it was the unvaccinated, that was the misinformation, but we think the exact same thing of the other side. Lots of misinformation. But the thing about that is that if it turns out, I don't think I am wrong, but if it turns out I'm the one on the side of the misinformation, I would be incredibly surprised. Like, it would be one of the most, like, my trust in myself would just disappear. Like, how could I feel so sure that I'm right, and if I was deceived, it would be incredible. It would be a massive bubble burst for me, because it's like, wow, how could I be tricked that much? And if I feel like that, I'm imagining vaccinated people feel the same. They feel just as sure. That's how it seems to me whenever I, watch videos from the vaccinated side of things. They feel just as sure that they're right. And so that would be like an incredibly, for them to be deceived, that would be like the most deception ever. It's a very strange time we're living in at the moment, with social media, the way information is spread, and the fact that we've got these two huge camps, and how two people can be so certain of their positions. So there's a lot of deception, and I think that's one of the things to bear in mind. If somebody, they've been deceived. There's a lot of deception. And then the last reason is that if, again, it turns out I'm wrong, which I really don't think I am, but if it did, I would feel very sheepish. I'd apologise as much as I could. I'd try to rectify what I did. I'd lose a lot of trust in myself, but I would hope that people would forgive me. That would be my hope. I'd hope that people would forgive me, have sympathy for me, and just understand, let me back. If that was, if I was wrong, which I don't think I am, but if I was. And so I think I should extend that to everybody else, to the vaccinated side as well. If I don't do that, if I don't extend sympathy to them, I can't expect it for me if I'm ever wrong. And I think that's a better way to do things. So I hope they're good reasons. I think these are reasons that I think are right. I'm trying to get to this point anyway. So yeah, it wasn't entirely voluntary. There was a lot of coercion, a lot of deception, misinformation. So there was that to bear in mind. Mistreated. The thing about the mistreated thing as well, if you watch my last video, there's a lot of people do things. Once you understand why somebody does something, it makes you feel, it softens your opinion of them. If you think of like Will Smith, the Will Smith slapper thing again, he did something wrong, but once you understand where he came from, you almost have pity for him. Like, once you understand that he was like in this cucked relationship, and this is how bullies, when you first see them, you think that's wrong, and they have done something wrong. But once you understand where they come from, usually it's quite a pathetic, kind of pitiful place, and you actually have pity for them and sympathy for them from where they come from. And so it's the same thing when if you've been mistreated, if you can understand where they've come from, this whole mass formation thing that's happened, it's probably born out of fear and anxiety and loneliness and things like this. And once you really understand it, so that helps to have sympathy as well. And the deserter thing, can't remember what I was going to say about that. I guess the deserter thing is just that everybody has a different breaking point of like cowardice or deserting. I'm going to have a breaking point somewhere as well. It's social pressure. People can only withstand so much, and everybody has their own bubbles of how much social pressure they can stand, how much their view of the vaccines was safe, how much delusion. Everybody's got their own bubble. So yeah, they're my thoughts. I'm babbling. But my final thought is this: I have this image of a doctor who goes to a mental institution to try and help the patients, and the mental people are just abusing him. They're hurling insults at him. They're flinging their poo at him, doing all kinds of stuff. And this doctor, still helps them and mends their wounds because he knows they're mental. And the vaccinated think the unvaccinated are mental. The unvaccinated think the vaccinated are mental. But this is an idea that transcends both sides. If we could just treat each other like, it doesn't matter who's mental. We can still love each other and have sympathy for each other, even if you think the other person's mental. And the sympathy part is like separate to the justice part and the true part. What's true and what's just is like a secondary, separate thing. We can still both have sympathy for each other if we understand that We're all being sincere. We're all trying our best. So I think I'm trying to get to a point like that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Okay, bye-bye.